Well, thanks very much to all of our panelists. So ODI's had 6 meetings now on Busan, 4 what we've called debates, which looked at fragile states, aid architecture, conditionality and results, and politics. We also had Bernard Wood in, who led the team that did the evaluation of 5 years of Paris that Brenda has mentioned, and who actually raised the issue of managing risks probably as the main thing that he wanted, or his team wanted to see added to the Paris, Accra, Busan process. Whether it will be, I don't know. So this is the 6th, and it's the last chance ODI is offering the public to influence the course of this debate. We've heard about the Sherpa meeting on Friday, so this is an opportunity really to say things to them. I'd also like to welcome belatedly the 70 or so people who are watching this online. They may also have questions, in which case please write in we've got someone, Malcolm is managing all of that. If there are questions, then he'll send them through to me. So what I'd like to do is, rather than come back to the panel after only a few questions, I'd really like just to open it up, and if indeed people do want to share their comments and questions. So I would ask you, though, to try and keep, please, in fact, definitely to keep your points down to a minute maximum, so that I can bring in a lot of people. So, Gideon.
Thank you, panellists, for a sort of really rich series of issues that you raised. I just wanted to come back on one issue that Jamie mentioned, and that is this question about how we broaden the range of actors that are addressed by the Busan outcome, the Busan discussions. And I don't think any of us would argue that it is a bad idea to engage the likes of China, to bring the South-South donors, who after all are really growing development players, at Busan. I think that's hard to argue against. And I think there's consensus that would be a great thing. But as Jamie said, there is this risk that bringing them in allows some of the other actors who have commitments they've already made to basically say, well, you know, if we're going to develop consensus amongst this broader range of actors, we maybe need to lower our ambitions. And I saw a practical example of that when I was in Paris at the last round of negotiations in early October around the discussions on tide aid. So what I'd really be interested to hear, especially from Brenda, but also from DFID and also ODI, is what are the practical proposals out there for bringing China into an agenda, but at the same time making sure that the other actors that have already committed stuff, especially the OECD donors, stay focused on meeting their existing commitments, but also building on those and really showing an example to the emerging actors and saying, we're serious, how about you come along and take some commitments yourselves?
Okay, thank you. At the back, and then Jess. And that's Gideon, he's a representative of the UK Aid Network. Please introduce yourself.
Hello, Sylvia Beals, HelpAge International. Thank you very much, the panellists, very helpful. Our network supports very, very disenfranchised older people across the globe. And we're really interested in this point about accountability, not just from the taxpayer, who, you know, the money given for aid, but exactly what Jamie was saying, the citizen and the potential of this process and other processes around it, and the MDG process including, of how does the poor disenfranchised citizen, the poorest of the poor, get to understand what all this is about. You know, aid is being spent on behalf of people who have no clue what is meant to get to them and are often excluded from the programs, in the case of older people specifically. So what is your advice? I mean, we all agree about the citizen accountability. I mean, all these words are really important. And I was at a session the other week with the head of Corporation of Brazil, who talked about we don't do aid, we do cooperation. We cooperate with our people. You know, what do you advise us to do with our network of organisations who are out there wanting to get involved in this, and so far are not there, and we don't see a way in?
Thank you very much. Jess? Lenny, I think there's someone else there as well. Oh, well, why don't we just go there straight away, actually? Sorry. Don't worry, I'll make sure.
Okay, thank you. Phil Sigley.
Just remind you, please do try and keep it to a minute, because I bet you there's a lot of people who can say something.
Phil Sigley, Federation of Cocoa Commerce. I think for Busan, I'd like to see on the aid effectiveness just how you address the agricultural sector. So much has been said by the World Bank and the EU. And I think what is critical is that there seems to be, and it's well preached here about complexity science and intellectual endeavour, we don't seem to have got it with agriculture at all in terms of how you build that capacity that the guy from EBI was talking about. Where does the investment come from? The private sector is limited to where it can come into the particular situations. Therefore, I do commend you to a paper by David Booth, which you'll see outside here, and it talks about the leadership and application of local systems and how you support those local systems. Without that support, I don't see how we're going to ever move forward with the agricultural movement in terms of better coordination, so that the rural poor, which is the big background of the EU process, can actually be brought into the mainstream. I don't think the development agencies have got that. Thank you.
Thanks very much. Coming round to, lady there.
Jessica Espy from Save the Children. Just a couple of things. Brenda, I really welcome the presentation of evidence, and I think we're all in agreement that the studies and evaluations that have been done by the OECD are excellent. But I think something else that's coming out of the questions as well as the floor is that, the politics is outweighing the evidence a lot within the discussions. I personally was quite alarmed by the number of things that were in brackets in the third version of the BOD. And for example, in the EU common position recently, which we've only seen in draft form, there was a really strong focus on inclusivity, which we talked about just now, but also things like country level results and calling for a dismantling of global structures. I mean, as Jamie said at the end, monitoring and evaluation and a deepening commitment to that kind of thing needs global structures and needs global coordination. One question would be to Brenda, which is how can we make sure that the evidence really stays front and centre within the discussions? And then a question to Lucia, which would be, I haven't seen a sort of strong UK position visible in the EU common position. There's not a deepening about any sort of discussion of untying, which we've been a real leader on. There's not really a discussion about IATI or a firm commitment. So just wondering what the UK is going to be doing to try and push that agenda forward behind the scenes over the next few weeks.
Thank you, Lenny. And then behind you. My plan at the moment literally is just to take a whole bunch. If we come back after all these questions, we'll end up not being able to bring you all in. So it means that we'll come back to the panel and they'll answer whichever ones they want to answer, which means some of you may not get your answers. But I think that's a better way of doing it. Lenny.
Thanks, Jonathan. Lenny Wild from ODI. Just a quick reflection. I thought it was really important and good to see risk being put on the table by a number of our panellists today. It's definitely been a linking theme of the events we've been doing here at ODI, and is an area that we're hoping to take forward a lot more work on in the future. I think there's different aspects to it, though. One is the recognition, perhaps, that we can oversell aid. I think the figures on domestic resource mobilization are a really good reminder that aid is only ever a very small part of the picture. It can be a catalyst, and we have some interesting proposals from the EIB in that respect. But we shouldn't overpromise on what it can deliver. And I think here we have to link directly to the results agenda, which should be not only about better measuring results, but our starting point about what it is we're trying to achieve, and being much more realistic in terms of what aid on its own can do. But I think secondly, it's this need, as Jamie was saying, for a new language, but also new systems and approaches to risk itself. The expectation that we can have a complete success rate is not feasible, but it's how do we manage failure, how do we manage the risks which will be inherent in a process like development, which I think will be the true test. And I think that's where we really need new propositions to put on the table. And I think it brings me back to the kind of reflection that we've perhaps had this line in the past, which Jamie also referred to, of kind of we'll put the money in if you sort the politics out. And I think it reminds us that donor country politics are very important too. And as we head into Busan, technical fixes will be important for specific problems, but there's also a bigger political fix that's needed and a bigger political debate that we need to be having, and perhaps there's a role for all of us in contributing to that.
Thank you, Lenny.
James Dean, BBC World Service Trust. Brenda, I wonder if you can help us navigate through the politics of this, and particularly in relation to the degree to which, as the number of actors increases, whether we are moving towards a more lowest common denominator consensus view on aid effectiveness. I guess part of this is seen through the lens of being a media support organisation. We saw that media wasn't mentioned at all in the last draft of a declaration. It was in Accra. I don't agree with this, but some of my colleagues in the media sector are saying, well, is this because there's a lot more sensitivity, this much more political area of support to media as part of a set of development or governance objectives, and is that coming from the number of new actors coming from this, or is it simply an oversight, or people do just disagree with that media is important as a source of accountability or whatever? So it's actually quite difficult to sort of surface some of the complexities going on in terms of just what the different landscape 5 years, 6 years on from Accra means for the kind of debates and the kind of things that are inserted and not inserted into the declaration.
Okay, thanks very much. Should we just come across here, and when we get to about halfway, we might come back to the panel for a round, and then we'll go out again. Well, in fact, why don't you be the last person then to ask a question in this session?
Okay, my name is Daniel Longhurst. I work for the FAO Liaison Office for the UN in Geneva. I just thank you for 4 very interesting presentations. I just wanted to return, and I guess this is firstly directed to Lucia, but also to the rest of the panel, to one of the questions that was presented in the blurb for this meeting, which sought to answer what DFID and other donors are hoping for from Busan, and how do they expect it to change their ways of working. I don't feel like I've got an impression. It's good to know the Secretary of State is energised. That's great. And I was just wondering, in terms of especially how you expect it to affect ways of working and so forth. I'm not clear if I've got that sense from the panel. So I
thanks very much.
Appreciate that.
Thanks very much. I think that's a fair point, and perhaps I was a bit ambitious in the way that I build this session, because I don't think actually the donors are necessarily ready to answer that yet. But they may or may not be. Just before I ask Brenda to begin to reply to some of those things, let me answer on behalf of ODI, or at least on behalf of me, because that's one of the points I want to make. ODI doesn't take positions. We're a group of researchers, and a lot of us have differing opinions, but I would point you in the direction of, it's already been mentioned, very interesting paper on ownership by David Booth, who's very respected in this field, and I think it's very, very worth reading. We're doing a lot of work on fragility, working closely with the G7 Plus group of fragile states and INCAF, and there's some papers they're outside, but also they're all on the website, to do with this event series as well. Also pointing in that direction. Myself and Andrew Rogerson wrote a paper trying to answer this question about how to bring in the rest without losing the best, as it were. And also Andrew's putting out a paper quite soon on what does catalytic aid mean. And we've heard about aid used to crowd in other resources. So there's a lot of work going on, and we're going to bring out a paper soon on risk as well. And I haven't mentioned a bunch of other stuff also on budget support. Basically, look on the website. I would just make one comment, which is on evidence. It may not be a popular comment. In my view, I don't quite agree with the way that Brenda put it, or with the way that Jess just put it, which is implying that all the evidence suggests that the last 5 years have demonstrated that the principles and the way of following them up has led to better development. I don't actually think that is what the evidence suggests. I think that certainly the evaluation, which is what Bernard Wood led, says that there is a plausible contribution. It's not exactly a strong link, but a plausible contribution that all of the effort that's been made has led to some improvements, especially in the health sector, which is what they look at. It's not an overall analysis of the impact of aid, it's an analysis particularly in the health sector. And I think that's really important evidence for us to take into account. But I actually think it's probably quite political, the way that we're being kind of managed to think that actually, the principles have worked. Not totally convinced by that. So I'm open to having a more political and an open discussion in Busan than this is my personal view. Brenda, maybe you'd like to answer that, or maybe not, but there's a whole bunch of questions.
Yes, I'll start with that. I mean, I would differentiate between I felt that the evaluation, maybe we need somebody to interpret the evaluation for us, but that the evaluation showed that the principles as an organising framework were the right way to go. I would completely agree with you that the way of doing these things, there have been some terrible mistakes, and some of the awful kind of coordination meeting, people held hostage in meetings to coordinate, which, you know, spend lots of money and don't go anywhere. But I think that the principles have held up, and that came out very strongly in the evaluation, and that it went beyond aid. It went, but yes, I mean, I think there's a lot of things been done in the name of aid effectiveness, which are at best waste everyone's time, and at worst were working in the other direction.
Just before you go on, why don't I just add, as you've got already about 1,000 questions, why don't I just add two? You won't really notice. But Barbara Garwilla, these come in from the online. Microfinance analyst at CGAP in Paris. What is CGAP again?
Consultative Group to Assist the Poorest.
Right. Emerging economies are important actors in development going forward, whether through ODA or FDI. Will they, especially the BRICS, play an active role in Busan, and what is their position on aid effectiveness? So we've had that already. And Sebastian Gerhardt, who's a researcher at the University of Warwick, question especially to Ms. Killen, I think. Where do you see the role, place of the Working Party on aid effectiveness in the architecture that has moved beyond DAC donor countries? So that's a very interesting question as well.
Yeah. Okay. Well, starting at the beginning with the questions, Gideon, how do we broaden the range of actors without watering everything down or letting people off the hook? And the way that the outcome document has been written from the start, and this is very, very clear in the co-chairs, was that we needed to find a narrative that could bring everyone in, but that there's a recognition that while we might have common goals, common principles, that each group gets there in a different way. So, but basically that means if you signed up to Paris, if you're in the DAC, you're still committed to Paris and Accra, but that others who provide different types of cooperation, including the CSOs who have written their own principles in the Istanbul principles, that there can be things that we all agree work, but we don't all have to do everything in the same way. So that's embedded in the outcome document, and our aim is to get as much into the preamble as possible, so we find as much common ground and pin that down. And then the rest of the outcome document then starts to differentiate between those who have already agreed to do certain things, continue to do that and go further, those who may provide cooperation, and often it's not financial cooperation, it's knowledge, and also let's not forget the hugely important, more important than anybody else, the role of the developing countries themselves, that they would achieve those principles in a different way. So that's in there. We also have the building blocks, so there may be some partners who cannot see themselves in the outcome document, but it may be possible to find other areas where they will publicly sign up and be held to account for working in certain ways. And I think especially with some of the actors, say in the private sector, the outcome document will be irrelevant to many of them, but we hope we can get some CEOs from the private sector to be associated with a particular building block, a particular set of actions on a specific initiative. And then finally, where we're looking at what happens after Busan, the focus is on the country level, because that's where you can bring everyone together, and that's where everything starts to become relevant. So I guess the aim is that there's enough things to have it visible, have it publicly accountable, and also pin things down, outcome document, building blocks, and then what happens at country level. I'll take the question on citizen accountability, and it kind of linked on something on the media that you said, James, because I was thinking about how can people get engaged with this and find out about what's happening and influence what's happening. And there's in the outcome document there's a description of what does it mean as we move from talking about aid effectiveness to talking about development effectiveness. And actually for us in Paris, media's in there. We haven't actually said media, but where we talk about that it's not just state institutions, it's non-state institutions as well. And so the assumption there is the media is in there, and we didn't need to list it in a long UN type list of everything, but that needs to be communicated better. And there will be a building block on effective institutions. So building capacities in country in the government but also outside of the government, and so that citizens can be informed and citizens can be brought in, and the media is crucial there, and it's something actually we've been trying to do as we've been doing work in the developing world wherever we've had an event on the Paris Declaration, to bring in the local media and try and build those links. So I should stay in contact with you to try and look at how we make this clearer, but the maybe it's a mark that it's become the norm if you don't have to be mentioned separately, but it is meant to be in there. But certainly I think that's an area where far more work needs to be done. It's not just explaining development in rich countries of providing aid, but also the role at country level, so that electorates and citizens can become engaged. On addressing in the agricultural sector.
Can I say something like that? Because I mean, it comes up all the time. You know, people need to know more. Isn't that a little bit just non-realistic? I mean, we need to limit our ambitions in what we can actually hope to achieve in terms of educating the broader. I mean, you touched on Jamie's. It's a provocative comment I'm going to make. Surprise, surprise. You know, Jamie thinks we should have a more intelligent debate with the electorate. You just said, and people say we should have we should try and engage citizens in recipient countries. I mean, what is the actual probability of that happening?
I'm not saying that we here should do it, but I think that
we've been talking about it for many years. Why to the next 5 years? Many others out there. I mean, I don't mean to be provocative, but many others out there who can be empowered to do it. We've been talking about that for the last 10 years or 15 years, empowering people to understand these things. It hasn't happened. Why should the next 5 years be different? Or in a sense, actually, even put it more positively, it has happened to a certain extent, and that's pretty much what we can expect from the next 5 years as well.
I think, there's been some interesting work going on actually with the BBC World Service, and I think that this is one of the features of the outcome document. It's not a question that a bunch of donors will get together and sort out the world and have a big strategy for everything. It's just that there are networks and groups who are engaging with this discussion, and then will go off and do their own thing. And I think that that's where it doesn't have to be controlled by donors, but having these networks linking together so that these discussions can go on and be taken forward by those who are meant to do it. And I think on discussions with media in countries like our own, often it seems to have gone backwards, the sophistication with which development is discussed, and often on the radio we'll move from incredibly detailed discussion of either something gone wrong with procurement in the defence industry or what's happening with the financial sector, and then we move to development, and it's as if everyone is the same people are listening, and I think they can cope with the same amount of sophistication there, especially on risk. Everyone knows there's no such thing as risk-free investment.
Can I have a crack at that when you've done?
Yeah.
Sorry, try and get through this quickly.
Sorry.
On agriculture, I think again some similar things there about using local systems. I also think that's an area where, say within the OECD, the discussions that they will have at Busan on looking at what happens in OECD countries themselves and their own policies. I think there's opportunities to have some much broader discussions about how all sorts of different policies from the OECD countries themselves down to the what happens in the developing countries, how those affect investment in agriculture. But I think that's, I hope, will be picked up in the discussions on effective institutions. On politics, too many brackets. I felt after the Working Party we had a lot of agreement on what should be in the outcome document. It was just that the exact wording couldn't be agreed. And for some of these issues, it was almost like one of those HSBC adverts where the same wording could be seen by some people as, oh my God, that's horrific, and others had to people as, yes, that's exactly what we want. And I felt on the EU's position on bureaucracy was because what we were calling for in the outcome document, we mean co-chairs, as a country-focused, globally light but very country-focused approach after Busan. They felt that meant bureaucracy. So I think this is where having a group of Sherpas come together and hopefully develop some ownership and some common trust around what they're trying to do. I hope we can get to the bottom of that. But I felt very positive actually after the Working Party meeting. Maybe I had very low expectations, but I felt that the differences were more on misunderstandings around the language, and that there are a few outliers, but best way to smoke those out is in a smaller group of Sherpas that have been told you've got to reach consensus. So I'm relatively optimistic we'll make some progress in those areas. Totally agree on risk. Don't overpromise, but we can't get rid of get rid of risk. What we need to get rid of is uncertainty, so we know that we're managing risk. The media, it's in there and it's very important. So I hope we can do more on to raise that understanding.
What about Jess's point about, there's a lot of evidence, but she feels that it's not been the danger that politics is taking over from the evidence. Do you feel that that's happening in the discussions?
I think the politics and the evidence, if we don't get the politics involved, then we don't get any progress at all. And we've had lots of evidence for the last few years and people coming up with some very workable technical solutions, but delinked from the politicians. So it's now the light's being shone on this because the ministers are going to Busan, so it has become very political. That's where the last few years of working on technical solutions is important, because as we see which way the politics is going, we can put different technical solutions on the table. But I agree, it's much more political now, but the evidence is there, and I think a few key things can be taken forward. Especially if you disagree, the evidence that this is the right way to go. So, but I think the politics is good, but we need to use Busan to tie people into agreements, whether it's the outcome document or building blocks, or empowering countries by having a much more country-focused process after Busan. The emerging economies, will they play a strong role? Yes, we're hoping to bring them in, and that's why we have Sherpas from middle-income countries. And the assumption is that those Sherpas will talk to other emerging economies, also with more of a explicit focus on South-South cooperation in the document. And the role of the Working Party going beyond the DAC. I think that the Working Party has the DAC is changing the way it does business, and I think it's moving, as many observers have said. We're moving much more to a world where there's different networks that come together, but it doesn't make sense to always talk about things only in one group. That this possibility to engage with others actually makes development more likely to happen, because you're not second guessing, you've got people around the table. Okay.
Thanks very much. We've got 10 minutes left. What I propose to the other panellists is actually that I just take the rest of the questions and then I come back. Otherwise, the next 10 minutes will possibly be taken up with you guys, and we won't have engaged everyone else. If that's okay, you'll end up with, I know, loads and loads of questions. You'll just have to choose whichever ones you would like to engage in. We'll come back to you, Marta, but we were going this way. Andrew.
Hello, Andrew Rogerson, for present purposes, ODI. I thank you very much for the panelists, and in particular, my work on catalytic aid has been referenced. I'm very interested in how other forms of development finance are mobilized. But I just wanted to press on this very last point alluded to by Brenda, and also, since I think everybody's got institutional positions on this, I'm going to really ask for Jamie's input on it. What happens after Busan? Simon Maxwell loves to say what really changes on Monday morning, in this case the 5th of December. What's really different? What are it's true that the real action should happen at a country level, but we mustn't be blind to the fact that a lot of the horrors perpetrated in the aid industry, or a lot of the sort of failings of the aid industry, a lot of good things, are actually created at a long distance away from the individual country context. So, and there are power imbalances, which mean that there need to be international accountability mechanisms of some kind and monitoring mechanisms. This was indeed one of the strengths of Busan, of the Paris-Accra process, that there was a system of monitoring and somebody was listening at the other end. It would be a real pity if after Busan we all agreed that it was a waste of money to have further extremely large international meetings, and we all agreed that the country should be empowered to deal with transparency and results, and everything will be hunky-dory. I don't see that actually as realistic prospect, and yet at the same time I don't see an alternative model as to who is going to hold whom to account, and how do countries use the outcome statement or whatever happens to be able to hold all the other actors to account. So this is supposedly about leveling the playing field. So my question is really, what kind of, if form follows function, what job needs to be done above the country level? And secondly, who is best suited to do that job? And I'm particularly keen on the people who obviously don't have an institutional position to defend on that. I do understand that the country doing modest things at the country level is the focus of everything.
Okay, thanks, Andrew. Is anyone else from this area? All right. Well, in which case, it's just Marta and gentleman here, actually, on your way. Here, Malcolm. Orange tie.
Right. Thank you very much. I'm working with the Korean embassy. It's, at the moment, I'm a point of contact with regard to this kind of subject. I'm 100% agree with your opinion on aid effectiveness and transparency focusing. But I would like to add some more point. Most importantly, not Western point of view, but the Oriental point of view as a kind of successfully developing countries' point of view. The Korea is the unique country which is successfully overcame the economic difficulty. So our country's position is changed from receiving countries to donor countries. So my point is that the most important thing is how effectively developed the countries. I mean, the development effectiveness is also very important. So sometimes much more than aid effectiveness. So I heard that HLF4, I mean the Korean delegates are preparing to emphasize on development effectiveness. So I hope those kind of point will be discussed in much more detail in Busan. Yeah.
Thank you very much. Thanks very much for coming. Martha.
I have a question for Daniel, whose contribution I particularly appreciated. I always find it is very important to get the views from people who operate from outside the aid system to get some refreshing views. And my question is about risk. I am very much in agreement with Jamie, Lenny and others that there is a real opportunity here to take a better look at what risks are involved in the aid business and how important it is to be more realistic and honest about it. However, I do have a slight concern, and that is that as we tend to do, I think, in the development industry, we latch on to this opportunity and say, it's all about risks now, and let's all make. So I want to ask you some advice, coming from a perspective of somebody who deals with the problem of risks and the implication it has when it comes to handling large amounts of money, on if we embark on this agenda of becoming much better alert to what these risks look like and how can we better manage them. How can we do it? What should we focus on? What will be the lessons that you've learned from lending operation that will help us sort of make sure that we get these crucial issues right, and then we don't go down the wrong path of just pretending that we only, it's all about risk, and if we only have a right narrative around it, will be our work will be done. Thanks.
Okay. Thank you very much. There's one other question from the ether for Daniel. Camila Teixeira from Fairtrade International. Question for EIB representative. I agree that the private sector does have an important role to play in development. Mr. Ottolenghi's proposition for concentrating aid in public-private partnerships and in particular blending grants with loans to provide incentives to banks to invest in the Global South sounds like a, quote, bailout package for development, a, quote, laissez-faire, which in my view has damaged our economy so heavily. The poorest countries in the world will continue to face challenges in governments, capacity, policy design, humanitarian and disaster relief, agricultural development, not all of which can be solved by the private sector, thus PPPs are not a panacea. Unless OECD countries maintain their ODA commitments under the Paris Declaration and MDG 8, we can be sure to be failing the poorest people in the world. That's one maybe that differed, would be interesting as well, because you focus a lot on the private sector at the moment. What I'd like to do now is bring in Lucia and then Daniel and then Jamie and then come back to Brenda for the last word. We are actually overrunning, so just just be as brief as you can. There's some suggestions here that Busan can be an opportunity to change the way that we engage. You've got to run. Okay. Well, you go first. You go first.
No. I didn't want to interrupt. Sorry.
Just
I
take a couple of
turn
minutes.
into a pumpkin in 60 seconds. So.
Sorry, Lucy, I'll just put Jamie first. So I'll ask you. This suggestion that Busan can be an opportunity to engage with the British public in a way that, let's face it, is slightly more difficult than what you and I have been engaged in for the last 10, 15 years. Do you think that's a possibility?
Well, put it like this, I'm not sure it's Busan that specifically is the opportunity. Busan is coming at a moment when we will be required to have a step change in the way we talk with the public because of an extremely brave piece of political leadership regarding Point 7. And it comes at a moment when, in just over a year's time, that money will have to be put in the budget, in the teeth of opposition from some groups, and there will have to be a national debate about it. So Busan comes at a very good time for that within the UK context. And so let's use Busan to get that conversation going in the right direction with that degree of greater intellectual honesty. So that's probably the reason why it might be different. It might be, by the way, not a conversation that goes very well. There's jeopardy in the conversation. But there is an opportunity wherever there's jeopardy, and let's try and take advantage of the upsides so that we don't squander this opportunity. That's in a sort of narrow parochial British perspective. But this country has often led on discussions about development in the last 10, 15 years. Let's try to do so here as well.
Okay. Thanks very much, Jamie. Thank you very much.
There was more I want to say on other things, but I've got to run.
Well, if you want to make two very quick...
No,
okay. If people do need to leave, I apologise. We're slightly overrunning.
Sorry.
But we'll try and finish in the next 5 minutes. Thanks, Jamie.
Cheers.
Okay, so I've picked 3 questions. Daniel, from the FAO, how do we expect it will change our ways of working? I think our focus is on the building block areas that we're engaged in, so results, transparency and fragility. On transparency, for example, leading on from what Jamie was just saying, because of the work that we and others have done on IATI, what we'd like to do is try to create a kind of a group of countries that will take this to the next level and make a demonstration effect for other countries that can then join us at a later date. On results, this idea of results compacts, the countries that are signing up to the building block will look to work together to build those results compacts in the partner countries that have decided to join the initiative. And again, we hope that that will have a catalytic effect on others as well. And on the New Deal, obviously, that is a new initiative that we are very supportive of, and we hope to see that fully reflected in the outcome document language. Second question, Jessica from SCF. Quite a timely question. We had quite a debate this morning on the phone with quite a lot of our European partners about the question of untying. And I think it's fair to say that this is still a conversation which is going on. What we've got to remember at this stage is that we are not really at the moment in the position where we're championing the UK perspective. We really are in the negotiation process, certainly at the Sherpa's level, representing a lot of other people. And so we need to try to make sure that we can do that properly. So watch this space. And then the third question was, it was in response to Jamie. I mean, we would entirely agree with his call to make sure that we have a step change of investment in statistical capacity, and also with his call for increasing focus on transparency of domestic resources as well as aid.
And this thing about not saying 100 pence in every pound will be used successfully?
Risk is something...
Because Daniel's bank would never say something like that. So how come Diffie's got itself into the position where it is?
Well, because you're talking different things. Because you're talking about I would say the traditional way of using aid that is in the public sector, and there the issue is of getting value for money. And of course, it's a matter of getting value for money even when you're putting funds in the private sector. But the meaning is different, and that is a danger I see, because and I'm coming here to the questions on risk. When for example, one of the things which is already happening, and people probably do not know that, is there are a lot of funds coming from national budgets and from the EC budget who are coming to the IB, who uses them for investment in microfinance funds, in equity funds that are doing turnaround business in Egypt. For example, we are restructuring now firms in Egypt after the revolution, try and get some job creation. And of course there, you're not going to be able to control the risk of every single investment you're going to do. A fund has to take a portfolio approach. If you have a microfinance investment fund, then obviously you're going to have some projects which are going to fail, others which will more or less break even, and some which will actually do very well. And that is the meaning of value for money. You want, as Jamie was saying, on average, to have a decent return, which will then, you give it back to the national budgets, and then they will do whatever they want to do with that. You see, and coming back now to and also the question I received from Camila Teixeira, I didn't say we should put all aid funds into private sector development. I said that there is already a small part of it that goes into private sector development and PPP. In Busan, there will be discussions of whether this share should be increased, but obviously all the issues that Camila raises, that is disaster relief, agricultural development, and government capacity policy design, those are the natural recipients of development aid. And I was never, I never said that should all go to the private sector.
Thank you very much, Daniel. Lucia, did you have anything else you wanted to add?
My senior colleagues are very engaged in the question of risk, but it's not something that I have been working on closely, so I wouldn't want to cut across the work of my other colleagues, so I think I'll decline to comment on that.
Thank you. Brenda, you can have the last word. It is something that Bernard Wood quite specifically talks about in the evaluation, isn't it? How can donors, I think it's how can donors, or how can risk be managed? Because he sees that as one of the barriers to progress, is that people haven't been prepared to put money on systems, for instance. That's the big one, because they're not taking the risk to. So is that something that is being talked about?
Yes, it is, and I think that this is an area. One of the problems, it comes back to this question about needing more statistics, needing more information, because it's impossible to challenge some of the extreme assumptions about. I'm always being asked for a number for how much aid gets stolen. You think, well, can we not just talk about the aid that actually has an impact? There's a whole number of things which conspire to make it very difficult to get a realistic assessment of what risk is, and then taking the conversation to a space where the private sector is quite happy to say we manage risk, and if something goes wrong we learn from it. And in fact there are many cases where something may have gone wrong in development but it's been dealt with, and particularly it's dealt with in country, that's actually a success in the end. If there is corruption and it's identified and it's prosecuted and people go to jail and things are strengthened, that actually in terms of the long term is a success. So we have a challenge to get the conversation into that space when we don't have the data to do that. I mean, I thought it was interesting listening to some members of development finance institutions talking about public-private partnerships. This is in the annual meetings in Washington, and how public money in aid could be used to deal with risk. And I thought that's funny because donors don't like to take risks, but somehow if it's associated with a private firm, it's seen as being better managed. But I think we do need.
I mean, I point out that in terms of communication, that is going to be a sticking point, because this concentration on value for money, will not go down well when you're talking about risk, because it is a concept of which is not applicable.
But actually, if I'm
not that is understood by the public. So there's a lot of work to be done on communication there.
Yep. And if I may come in, I think we need to think really carefully about what actually is the role of aid there. I guess I haven't read your paper, Andrew, but aid. How can aid be catalytic? And that if aid is free money, government to government, in a way it's too valuable to just give away. How do we bring it into a relationship with the private sector where it does something that can't happen otherwise? It's not simply an interest rate subsidy. I think some of the lessons, say, from public-private partnerships in OECD member states. Where they've gone wrong, it's because the legal framework hasn't been written up properly. It's because there haven't been the people who can manage the contracts. It's actually really, really challenging, but maybe that's where aid should be
Can I just ask
focusing.
one last question, and then I'll close it. It's Andrew's question about how we all know country level is important, but what bureaucracy is there going to be after Busan to ensure some kind of pressure on donors? Because that's one of the reasons Paris has been quite successful, is that actually there's been a monitoring bureaucracy.
Yeah.
It looks like that's not going to happen.
It's the proposal that's there and that needs to be discussed further, is that we do continue to have something which is brought together at the global level to back up what can happen at country level. Some countries have good examples of developing ways of managing all their donors, all their finances. And there are opportunities there to have South-South cooperation to help other countries do the same thing. But without something globally, I mean, it shouldn't be heavy and bureaucratic or whatever, but if there isn't anything to shine a light at the global level, I think it would be very difficult to back up countries that want to keep their development partners under control.
Okay, thanks very much, Brenda. Thanks very much, Lucia and Daniel as well, and Jamie.